Happy Monday, everybody. How's it going?
It's going well. Happy Monday, Joe. Welcome, John.
Thank you very
Yeah, welcome,
much.
Joe.
Glad to
Thanks very
have you
Yeah, good
much,
to see
here.
guys,
you.
for having me. Yeah, great to be seen.
Seen and heard. Yeah. How was your weekend?
Oh, great. It was really good. Our son is getting married at our house end of the month, so we're doing all the wedding prep. So
Oh,
all the stuff that
congrats.
we've been putting off, for a few weeks, if not months or years, just tidying up all that stuff. So yeah, it's been fun. And so he's been out helping out, and yeah, just getting back into the carpentry a little bit and building stairs, all
Nice.
that fun stuff. So yeah, it should be a lot of
Building
fun.
stairs. Okay.
Oh yeah, my nemesis, stairs. Got to do maths on stairs.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, for context, we are talking about this kind of before we started, but you used to build what?
Log houses for a living, yeah. So I basically decided when I was 36 that the career arc on house building, especially log house building, was pretty short. So I decided to get into something different, and the different thing I got into was computers. So yeah.
That's a journey. And so, how did you jump from building log houses to computers? Like, how did
That's
Oh
a
that
logical path, though,
process?
Matt. I mean, come on. I mean,
yeah, that's the Sugio, and that's pretty reasonable. So the last house I built was was near Calgary, and some friends of mine were in the nightclub development business, and they needed somebody to wear two hats. One was like doing some cabinet making and things like that, and whatever handy kind of stuff. But they needed somebody to get their accounts in order and maybe put some payroll in place. And this was pretty early on in the computer days. So I bought an IBM XT with I think I can't remember what it was, some really small level of RAM for 12,000 bucks and 64K of RAM maybe. It was really weird, and with the hard floppy disks. So I started programming in DBase 3 to get their payroll thing is all that done, and then I realized that there was a bit more to like a lot of startups. They kind of ran out of cash regularly, and I'd
hmm.
come home. My girlfriend said, "So rents today," and I said, "So anyway," that kind of thing. So I started working for, and this is a great segue into that. So I took my skills to Mount Royal University, and they needed a data analyst or an information analyst for their executive branch. The problem they were having, it was taking them 4 months to do their quarterly reports. So that doesn't really help you much, right? So you're
Huh.
constantly behind. They're constantly doing extracts. They're constantly cleaning data, all the stuff that we still see today. And so my job was to say, is there any way we can speed this up so we can get more reliable reports and do something more than just saying, yeah, you had 2018 students. Okay, that's what we did. And actually, in the spirit of this conversation, that kind of started. We actually started liquefying all of their operational data. So we had student registrations, we had instructor workload, we had budgets, we had room utilization, we had all of this people, places, things, data all over the place, and of course, different formats. So we took it all apart, we deconstructed it, and then we reconstructed it in something called SPSS. It's a statistical software, and started building reports on that. And it took us over a year to get to the point where we were confident that what we were building, because we could give the source departments almost immediate feedback on the quality of their data and how it fit in. And we could also answer, there was a lot of politics around it, especially with academics and the senior executive. And we started doing activity-based costing with the data. So we actually started putting it on a temporal plane. So that's another big issue that's still kind of hanging around here, is how do you manage things that happened in the past that are happening now and then project them into the future. So yeah, when we took it all apart, put it all together, we were doing some really cool stuff. And the executive actually liked it at first because it kind of confirmed their bias on what was going on in the academic departments.
Hmm.
And then they didn't like it after a little while because we started to get pretty sophisticated on the analysis, and it started showing that the academics departments weren't exactly wasting as much money as the senior executive thought. So now they're both armed with the same data, and they can have a discussion, they can have a conversation. So that's kind of where that whole transition kind of happened. From there, again, it's sort of like, okay, so the big revelation there, we were sort of doing nascent data warehousing without knowing anything about dimensions and stuff. So we had, like I say, students, academics, we had executives, all of those people roles. And then we had activities and things like that. So we started to realize that all of the things we were deconstructing had exactly the same dimensions. So people, places, things, activities, functions, and time. So then I got a job I was headhunted by a firm in Oakland, California called Documentum. And that was before OpenText bought Documentum. So they're a content management software. And it turns out that and as we know, the architecture of content management is simply an Oracle database sitting on a file store for the most part. That about sums it up, right? The key to making that work is version control and classification. So when we go into companies like Cypress Semiconductor, we did a little bit of work for Larry Ellison, which was really interesting. And then we wound up in BMC Software in Houston, and I'll add more to that in a minute. But it turns out that the classification dimensions for content are exactly the same as the dimensions on analytics.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the next progression for that was when I was in Houston, we were working for a tech pubs team documenting software. And this is where that multiple of multiples comes in, Joe. So they had multiple products, multiple product lines, multiple versions, multiple platforms, multiple languages. They had to try to document all of this stuff according to the code they were given to test, right? So for better or for worse, they tried to shoehorn all of that stuff into Documentum. And that's when I realized that you need to get way more granular on this stuff in order to make all of those multiples of multiples work, right? Because you can't do it in a folder structure. You can't do it in a relational database. It's too fine. It's too granular. So, for example, product names were hold that thought. So the tools we were using were pretty crude. It was kind of like wooden clubs and fire flamethrowers and stuff. So we weren't really getting anywhere with the client because they were frustrated that it wasn't working. So they stored their content. Some of their content is little tiny files, like it could be as small as a copyright statement. And typically databases aren't very good at that. You can do that now, but so the next phase of that sort of development from the log house building to where we are now was the introduction of graph technology. And so what I've been doing, so I've applied this technology neutral, technology agnostic, language approach in I think 7 or 8 different verticals. I used to have 6 major categories, and they aligned with Rudyard Kipling's 6 honest serving men. Now we have 19. So I've worked in 7 different verticals, and I haven't found bucket number 20 yet. So the interesting thing, I think, to me anyway, is because it's technology agnostic and concept neutral, when you encounter a word in your business like or a phrase, or let's say a role name, senior business analyst, most people want to bolt that onto a person right away. But what the graph allows you to do is create something called a hypergraph, and we're just starting to work with this now. But if you think about senior business analyst as a role, that phrase as a role, you can assign all kinds of capabilities and requirements and documentation and everything else to that particular hypergraph that sits that basically exists all on its own. And if your company has a role called senior business analyst and you go out to hire one, now you're starting to add, details on like a job description and all that kind of stuff. So the way that we classify all of that stuff is consistent from business to business to business. So a person, Joe Reese and Matt Housley, are people first, full stop. You have multiple roles, but there's only one of each of you. So again, the approach is, it's almost like object orientation in a way, if I can say that without getting stoned, not in a good way. So when you put, for example, where was I going with that? Shoot, I had the business analyst and I lost it on a stolen remark. That's too bad. But yeah, you get the idea. So the idea is, a person is a person. So when you put the attributes of a person in a hypergraph, the attributes for Matt Housley are unique to you, right? I'm sure there's another Matt Housley out there somewhere, but those attributes are going to be unique to that Matt Housley, and we'll have a different unique identifier. So when Matt Housley is a show host, that's a role. So you bolt those two together. When Matt Housley is a radio engineer, let's take it, that can be bolted to the Matt Housley that we know. The plastic surgeon Matt Housley he's a different hypergraph as Matt Housley, but he's bolted onto a different role too. So you're basically, this is all about creating stability in the data environment, because the biggest problem right now is that while data persists, technology, as we all know, is changing so rapidly, it's really hard to keep up. And so when a data initiative fails, as apparently the statistics are still pretty horrible about them, senior execs want to say, okay, that wasn't my idea. I'm going to fire Josephine, and I'm going to hire Snowflake and Databricks, and they're going to come in and fix our problems. So that's where we're at right now. And so the graph makes it really easy to get really granular, for example, with business glossaries and tie them to metadata. But it comes with a warning. So, like every other new technology, creating a knowledge graph for a business, or say you have multiple knowledge graphs, you can also create silos pretty quickly again. Right? So it's no different. It's basically, so if you put the three of us in a room and said, I want you to create a conceptual model for university, we could probably do that in a graph. No, not having any SMEs on the board, we could probably drag somebody in, but we would likely create a conceptual model of three of them would be all different. We might even create 4 different ones. So that's kind of the danger. They're very powerful, they're very flexible, they're very fluid. And the downside is they're very powerful, they're very flexible, and they're very fluid. When you have some guidance on the language side, like we're talking language first in our business, the guidance on the language side says the guardrails are that you're only allowed to classify something as you see it. So Los Angeles, right, as you see it, the first thing that comes to mind is LA is a city. It has an abbreviation LA, it's in California, all of those facts, right? But Los Angeles is also the name of a baseball team. Los Angeles is also the name of a, that, you get the idea? So you can only classify it as you see it. And then, because the classification process gives you some idea of identity, every granular piece has an identity, every granular piece has a class, and every granular piece has what we call sort of an attractor to some equivalence. So it's all about semantics at the front. The identities we give these very granular pieces of language are based on semantic interoperability principles. The other thing that comes into play is FAIR. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. What we found in the at the BMC gig was authors are really not fond of using other authors' stuff. The other thing was, if you can't find it, you can't reuse it. So the way that these things are classified gives you really good techniques for triangulating things like GPS and saying, okay, I found a collection of content that I might be able to use.
So there's almost like a library sciences tie here, I would say, John, right? We've had a couple of guests on who've talked about the library sciences angle with data.
Yeah, a little bit. The difference, I think, Matt, is there's no hierarchies here. Like the classification is completely flat. You have one thing at the top and you branch out into 19 categories, and that's it. And the reason for that is because language already has a way to build in specificity. So if you were, for example, to say, let's talk about a canary. So canary has just, it's more like the biological thing. If I want to say the canary came from the United States, or want to say it's that a certain species of canaries from the United States, it's a canary. So the specificity is already built into the way language works. Do you know what I mean? So whereas a library, sort of like the Ranganathan concept, or the hierarchy of subject areas, hierarchies are really difficult to maintain because they tend to be brittle. Now, having said that, I'll go back to my comment before and say, if you do the classification for the semantium classification first, and then you want to build a hierarchy of terms using whatever hierarchy you want to put in place. The principle is that if you want to use any piece of information to create that, it has to be registered in the granular, in the glossary, if you will. So how many times have you, like, and this happened a lot too when I was doing content management, is people would come across a term reading a product spec or a process diagram. They didn't know what it meant. And I think that the model that we're using now, sort of that I'm using in my head anyways, is kind of based on the Kindle model. So if I'm reading a book in Kindle, I don't know what a word means, I just hover over it and there it is. There's a definition, right? It's immediate. But those definitions have to be declared up front.
So you don't want them changing on the fly, right? You don't want that
No.
level of, yeah.
Yeah, and that's another one of the debates that we talked about with data having value or context changing the meanings of words. If the way I look at it is, let's say if I have a homograph called pick. So a pick is kind of goes with a shovel, pick and shovel, but a pick is also somebody I grab in a draft, right? So if I have pick and I want to use it, then I have to have it will have both of those values in the glossary.
What are your thoughts on this in the context of data modeling, Joe? I know you've been thinking a lot about these problems. I mean, linking to what you're saying, John, we often have this ambiguity of terms that shows up in business. We also have a lot of ambiguity of data. So, for example, you have data siloing where different teams will interpret numbers in different ways or define customer in different ways or come up with different statistics about revenue because they define it slightly differently, which creates all kinds of conflict and dysfunction. And I think, Joe, that's something you're interested in terms of how a data model is designed.
Oh, yeah. These are kissing cousins. Yeah. So it is interesting, though. I feel like the notion of data modeling, I think, has been thrown out the window for the most part anyway. But I think in practice, it seems like the business language discussion, too, it's taken for granted a lot. Like we just sort of do our thing and, as departments or people or whatever. And so I don't know. In some ways, this is obviously incredibly important discussion. On the other hand, I feel like a lot of this is it's going to be fresh to a lot of people, right? Business language, for example, it's something that we do implicitly, right? Modeling is something you do implicitly, whether you do it or not consciously. Right. But I think the formality of it has been lost to a whole generation of practitioners. So it'll be interesting to see, I think, kind of, because this is something I've been thinking a lot about too, is just business language concepts, stuff that John's been talking about. How it relates back to data modeling, I don't know. I think it's just a matter of educating people this stuff exists, first of all. So
yeah,
that's been one of the big pieces.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think the most successful way that we've done it is to concentrate on concepts first. It sounds like, oh yeah, you always build a concept model first, but it's not really a model because there's no attributes. So modeling a business, for example, say you're in the mergers and acquisition department for an advertising firm, right? So modeling your target acquisitions business is not going to be that different from yours because that's the business you're in. But the point is, when you get a bunch of people in a room, say, we're not talking about data here at all. We're not creating a data model. We're not going to bind the hardwire the conceptual model into data because it's constantly changing. But the question is okay, so let's say we have customer. We'll use customer because it seems to be the one that gets everybody all.
Everyone talks about customers, and yeah.
So in the conceptual sessions, we grab a definition from Merriam-Webster and saying, how close is this to what you describe as a customer? Mm-hmm. And if we can get agreement on the definition of the word customer, part of the reason that people have so much trouble with customer is if you're talking to an ERD guy or a data model, a physical data model guy, customer has all kinds of ways of putting all that information together. There's all kinds of structural implications. So when the three of us talk about customer and Joe's thinking about structure and Matt's thinking about semantics and I'm thinking about something else, we don't really have a common sort of way to discuss exactly what we're trying to accomplish. But the other thing that comes up quite regularly is what I call the missing word phenomenon. So Joe's in marketing, Matt's in engineering, and I'm in HR, or I'm in finance. Marketing customers are a slightly different animal than engineering customers, than finance customers, or accounts payable customers. Right. So reconciling that is, again, making sure that people understand about the language semantics of how we're using that word. That's all.
Mhm.
And it actually diffuses, like we've been in bun fights all over the place with the meaning of metadata, right? And
Mm.
when you try to get prescriptive on engineers or on finance people, they say, we have our own language. We don't need this stuff. So instead of banging your head against it, we just sort of lean back a little bit and say, okay, you can have yours as long as you tell us which one you're using, as long as you indicate the context, to your point, Matt, about, okay, we're using marketing customer in the context of this report. But customer has to be a little bit elevated, because if you're going to talk to the CXO or would anyone level above that, you need to be, talking their language, not engineering, not marketing, not finance, just customers. So the question now has a grounding and saying, okay, when you ask that question, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah,
Because the way so you're counting, I mean, in a relational database, you're counting records, not people or not companies. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
well, and just creating accountability, to your point, actually forces teams to be more precise in how they define things for themselves. Just saying, okay, what do you mean by customer? Sometimes it
Right.
turns out they haven't actually thought it through that carefully in their
But
semantic
how do you
meaning
do
of
this
just
in a
use
way that's
data.
not annoying,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah,
I think
that's
how do you do this in a way that doesn't annoy the crap out of everyone you're talking to? Because I think this is one of the cruxes that
Yeah,
data
exactly.
modelers face, is people just say, "Well, I have a job to do. Like, why are you asking me these questions?"
Yeah.
So,
And I think who's the fellow that was it Reiner that's written the data governance, the stealth data governance book?
I don't know
It's
about that one.
Yeah, so
Interesting.
I'll look it up, but and send you the link. But basically, he's saying there's a whole bunch of less confrontational and less annoying ways of doing that kind of thing.
Hmm.
So, and I totally agree. I mean, it's, we always run into in companies that we're working for, there are people who are really keen to solve this particular problem, and people that say, you touch that, you die. Right. The pitchforks and
Rob
flamethrower
Steiner.
crowd.
Okay, I'll check
Rob
this
Steiner,
out.
is it Rob?
Yeah, I think it was Rob Steiner. That's what Gordon said. What's up, Gordon? Fellow Canuck there. Yeah, I'll go check this out. That sounds like Scott Taylor also has a really good book on how to talk to the business. I would say get that.
Right.
Scott, the data whisperer, says what's up. But yeah, this is because I feel like there's been a lot of these techniques over the decades, right? Semantics, graphs, data modeling of various shapes and forms. But I feel like we're still at the same place as an industry
Yeah,
that we were decades ago.
exactly. Because I think you made the point earlier, Joe, it's not something that people actually think about formalizing, because the thought of formalizing business language gives everybody a headache. But we did in the example of the mergers and acquisition, we modeled the business in 2 days. And we did it with two subject matter experts in the room, and it was, full time for like 16 hours. But we basically did that live with a knowledge graph, and we were explaining the principle. It's the principles of the of the classification stuff that's really powerful, because language doesn't change much. The data, the data explosions that we see are combinatorial. They're not elemental. So, like in a business, like I've worked at a lot of high value businesses, they have 40% of their content, 40% of their data is duplicate. So I think the value proposition here is to get to your point about nothing has changed really, is to say, okay, why don't we flip that question around and say what has changed, or what
Yep.
doesn't change? And this way of managing business language gives you a platform you can stand on to handle anything. So because it's technology, and I'm not shilling here, I'm just sort of saying the approach. But yeah, no, I know. It's one of those unavoidable things for startups. But anyway, but the approach is repeatable, extensible. It just, all that means is that you get new data. Let's say the HR department, or in a lot of cases, marketing comes to us first. So marketing, HR is another good one. let's say you get them to sit down in a room with some people to say, okay, what's your business really all about? Who are your customers? Who do you serve? What's your data look like? Or what's, that kind of thing, and just model their high level, non-attributed language of their particular domain.
Hmm.
Say, okay, now we're going to go a level deeper and say, what data do you need to get all that done, to knit all that stuff together? And then they start talking about content and data, and okay, so let's talk about where the data comes from, and you can start to do process diagrams and all that kind of stuff. So I think what's missing is really there is no formal specification for a foundational piece of this. And I just read another article about data modeling and data, how you express data structures and stuff, and it was almost unreadable. Like, you couldn't put that in front of a business person and say, you have to be very practical. The magic has to be practical. So
Yeah.
tell me what you need and when you need it, based on this particular understanding of the concepts you're dealing with every day, and we can go from there. It's all about stability. It's all about, so if data persists, as my partner says, and technology does not, we need to make the principles for managing. So let me put it another way. If data exists in the midstream, let's say, and the business is creating data upstream, the thing they're creating data with is the language of the business. Full stop.
Right.
So if you manage, it's like that old proverb, if you manage, or the 110-100 rule, if you manage your upstream supply chain to the point where you're getting quality goods into the midstream, your midstream costs go way down. Everything starts to stabilize.
Yep.
Roche is doing a really, really cool project now with FAIR. They call it FAIR from birth. And they've realized too that their data has to be granular to be fair, because granular is the way you find stuff. Granular is the way you manage quality of stuff. Small things need definitions, right? And sorry, Matt, I had a little skip moment there. The whole thing about context is, if words have two meanings, you need to actually make those both available for
Yep.
context to work. You can't create a new context out of a word or a meaning of a word that nobody knows, right? So for pick, it has to be either an implement I use to dig trenches, or it has to be something that I use in a baseball draft. But you can't use pick. You can't create a new context just by putting words next to pick if the context doesn't already exist. That's all my geeky stuff for the day. But I think you're right, Joe. I think that's the value prop, is that if you can put some stabilizers on all of this crazy stuff that's happening with tech, and just talk about the business and use business language as a starting point of things, I think things get an awful lot easier. And here's another, another reason, like I go to a lot of conferences where there's one day, low cost, all that kind of stuff. I went to a Snowflake conference in Calgary, and near the end, I asked the guy about semantic interoperability, and he sort of goes, yeah, the customer kind of does that on his own.
Oh, I remember this one. Yeah.
Yeah, because we talked about that too, right?
Hmm.
And it's like, okay, but you guys, it's right in your literature. It says interoperability. I'm assuming, like everyone assumes, that's what. So this is where semantic interoperability starts. This is the headwaters of making all that stuff work. So I'll give you another quick example. Healthcare is notoriously bad for mismanaging data.
Yes. Yeah. The whole struggle over electronic medical records, for
Right.
example, that's been going on for at least
Mhm.
20 years.
Yeah. How many new body parts has anybody named in an anatomical book in the last, I don't know, millennial, 100 years, thousands, million years? None. So if you know, like if you can make a glossary of anatomical terms available to an EHR, and you make say other glossaries or other dictionaries available to an EHR, then you start to solve these problems. Like SNOMED and MESH don't talk to one another. They're talking about the same body, the same human beings that you can do stuff with. They have conditions, they have accidents and incidents, they have drugs, they have treatments, all of that, and they have indicators, right? But ICD-10 or ICD-11 now, I guess, and MESH and SNOMED and all those ones, they're completely unconnectable unless you take them apart. So think about a component in a SNOMED classification, and think about almost identical component in in ICD 10, 11.
I
Sorry.
don't know what either of these are, but yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. What?
So these
Wow.
are EMR,
That's a
EHR
class.
standards,
You-
I
okay.
think. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're used for, yeah,
Clueless.
exactly. Sorry, Joe.
No worries.
That's the classic mistake that I do climb on people for doing that. Okay, you're throwing around acronyms nobody knows what. That's not nice. So these are standard ways of classifying things. But I think there's like 12, Matt, if I'm not mistaken, 12 active standard ways of classifying medical stuff now.
That's wild. So, so basically, in the process of developing EMR, we've created this huge mess of different standards.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of like that old joke. I love standards. There's so many of them. They just, it's amazing, right? So when you break it down, like we did at Mount Royal University, when you break it down into components, and it sounds like one of those exercises where, it's going to take years to get this done, but these days it does not. Like these days, there's all kinds of, and we actually ran a workshop at the University of Calgary last month or the month before, where we use LangChain to do auto classification of these kinds of things.
Oh, interesting.
And we put them in the Semantium classification thing, and we put them in. So we basically took the old Chestnut, the Northwind's grocery thing, and we said, okay, so this is all of the elements of Northwind. These are all of the metadata values. These are all the table values. And we put them all in LangChain and said, okay, go ahead and classify everything in a column, any column in this one, and away it went. So when you have, so basically what we did was Q6 is the name of the classification. We taught LangChain to learn how to classify according to the Q6 protocols. Now, the thing is, if the protocols are as universal as we think of the ways that you can apply this to legacy data. It doesn't, Q6 semantic, we don't care. The language model doesn't care whether the data is embedded in COBOL or Fortran or any other application out there, because it's persistent. Yeah, it has certain rules about syntax, semantics, and similarities. So it's a whole different way of looking at and applying the rigor and discipline upstream and flattening that whole spending curve in the middle. Think of another thing. So if that works, if the premise is true, then you shouldn't have to do ETL at the end of the day. And this is what I think needs to happen in order for that to happen, is Dave McComb's data-centric movement, where he's talking about because we have all of these copies and all of these ways of describing things, we need to get to a point where we have a data-centric collection of information that's of value to the company, right? And when that data-centric collection is classified according to these 19 buckets, they're already dimensional. There's 19 different ways of accessing everything in your business, and they call them vectors. So a vector database with 19 vectors is exactly what we're using to say, okay, and again, it's a trading card model. In the middle, the data-centric thing is okay, I've got the string Joe Reese comes into the middle, and it goes and basically goes trading card, got it, need it, got it, that kind of thing. It could be a different Joe Reese. The fact that it's a duplicate sends off a flag, but you get the idea. So the architecture of data centricity means that applications now are going to be built to subscribe to the data in the middle, but all applications will also hold sensitive data on their own right.
Yep.
So I think we're due, and it's hard. Like, and I know myself, I've been working on this for a while, but I think we're due with ChatGPT and everybody understanding that LLMs are a little bit wobbly when it comes to what comes out of them. But when you put something like this underneath it and say, okay, wait, first of all, any term that you're going to use the issue we were responding to, I'm starting to chop up my sentences. That's typically not a good sign. The reason that we approached this LLM thing was because of the stories about people putting their enterprise data into ChatGPT. Yeah, not a good idea.
I heard a story like that this morning. Actually.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Yeah,
what
one of
did
my
you hear,
friends
Matt?
texted me about it.
What did you hear, Matt?
Oh, it was nothing specific. It's just like, yeah, it's crazy. Someone put this data into ChatGPT without even thinking about the fact that it's proprietary. So,
Oh,
Yep. Yeah.
Say
so there
more.
it
it
is
happen all the
on
time.
the internet.
Yeah, it's not good.
No. So the
what was this
challenge.
data set so we can maybe go retrieve it later?
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. We'll
Jeez.
try to extract it from the training.
Yeah. There you go.
but they
Yeah.
do have a
So
setting though. You can tell it not to
right.
store the data for training.
Right. And the
Well, and
line
let's be
change has
honest.
to, yeah. Sorry.
These
Not that they
always
do
turn
that, I don't know.
into enterprise features, right? Any like really high security feature like SAML. So eventually you're going to have to pay like for a way more expensive subscription where they guarantee that they won't leak your data. That's what's going to happen.
Right. Right. And then, yeah, someone will find a way to do that anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting to bring up Dave McComb, though, the data-centric movement. I'm a big fan of it. Actually, Matt, you have that book, Software Wasteland. I let you
that's on
borrow
my
from
shelf.
Dave. You need to read
Yeah.
that. That's a good
Yeah.
one, too. I
That's
was talking
awesome.
to Dave the other day. He's going to
Yep.
be on the show pretty soon. So,
Oh, good.
yeah, good dude. Yeah, he's working some really cool stuff, which I'm not going to talk about, but stay
No.
tuned. It's going to be dope.
Yeah,
But
Yeah, he was at the same conference at University of Calgary, so always great to talk to him.
Nice.
He's such an upbeat guy.
super smart guy. Yeah.
Yep.
And his whole notion, too, of I think applying a graph really on top of the data, I think was very interesting, right? So he's making this a first-class citizen as well in the data-centric book, right? So,
Yeah.
but applying that with LLMs, I mean, there's some research into that too. Really good papers about LLMs and knowledge graphs, and it's how it helps solve the hallucination problem. So, I'm curious to see where that all kind of goes to. But
Yeah, and for some of your listeners that want to, or viewers that want to hear more about, who was it? The mathematician Steph Wolfram, has written a really good article, in my opinion, because I didn't know really anything about it until I read his thing about how is GPU working and why does it work. So really, really interesting. Well done. So, but yeah, like, so the response was to like, how would you partition that? So basically, we use the LangChain, the power of the LangChain, to say, okay, this is some data that we have. These are our guidelines. This is the discipline we want to apply. We put it in a Jupyter notebook, and had all the participants of the workshop just follow through in the on the workbook. It was pretty cool. And the thing is, there's lots of really neat stuff that are happening with graphs now that weren't happening before, like enterprise knowledge graphs. And the way we look at it, the way I look at it, is that the missing ingredient is still that bottom, right? Because there's a danger that people will, like, shiny new toy and you go running around with it and drive it off a cliff. So the danger, I think the discipline that's required that Roche is actually getting into, not with classification, but when you take the language first approach to data management, you can make all kinds of really cool improvements quality wise upstream of everything else. So the other conference that we were at, and again, this is a similar example. We gave every piece of data a UPC.
Oh yeah, that's right. We were talking about this.
Yep. Yeah, we treated shopping for data like shopping for groceries. I mean, and people say, when I first started this, it's like, oh my God, you want to put tomato as a value in a business glossary? What the hell would you do that for? This is too granular to be hundreds of millions of entries, right? Turns out that's not the case. But in a grocery store metaphor, if I want to buy a single tomato, it's got a barcode, it's got a supplier, it's got all that information attached to a single thing, right? So I think that's where the industry needs to go, is to say, look, your language, the language that you use in business every day, and when Matt and I were talking about competitors earlier in the backstage, your competitors are using a lot of the same data, like a lot of the same reference data, whatever you want to call it, right? So why spend all that money managing reference data when you can subscribe to a UPC compliant supply chain that says, oh yeah, Los Angeles is a city in California. There's also a Los Angeles in Costa Rica. There's also a Los Angeles in Colombia. Isn't that interesting? But like that kind of thing. So now language becomes a commodity. It becomes a means to an end, rather than someone says, oh, you know what we should do with that content is slap a bunch of metadata values on there. And Joe goes, well, Matt, what metadata values do you want to use? Well, Matt says, I've got 64 of them. Joe, is that okay with you? You go, yeah, I don't think so. most people, like your point, Joe, just want to get their job done. So these large language models now are capable of grabbing content and turning it into knowledge graphs and all that kind of stuff. But all we're interested in is saying we just want a UPC code or UPC string on a document that tells me what it's about, who authored it, and those kinds of questions, like 3 or 4 basic questions automatically. Now, the other thing, and I'll throw this by you guys just because I've done this before, the assumption in the model is that the same 19 vectors that I use to classify content and words and data are the same vectors used in business intelligence applications. So if I want to know which customers bought which product at which location for which price by which method, yada, all that kind of stuff, those are all vectors. Those are all dimensions into that particular block of stuff. Agree or disagree, and feel free to poll the audience.
Sorry, my kid was sending me a text on Gab. What was the question? Sorry.
So
They keep sending me pictures of bananas.
Okay.
Oh, your kids?
Yeah. See?
I think from my perspective, there's a lot to be said for more standardization, to your point, John. And I think in business and in data in general, we do a lot of reinventing the wheel, right? Because you go subscribe to Snowflake, off-the-shelf cloud data platform. It behaves a lot like Oracle or Teradata or whatever you've been using in the past.
Right.
Which means
Matt, that's sacrilege. Don't say that.
but it doesn't build in any data standards, right? It's completely generic. And so
Yeah,
for
that
that
part.
reason, businesses do spend a lot of time kind of reinventing the wheel on metadata, on UPCs, and a variety of other things,
Right.
where they could just do things in a standardized way and do 99% of what they need to do without customization, and then spend some effort on that 1% that's different.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I was saying
You got a
to,
question?
what's that?
Oh, I've got a question from Brian Green, if you want to take it real quick.
Sure.
He asks, are there any software analytics frameworks out there that are using a graph model as their native information modeling constructs?
Just going to read it again.
And to me, this is interesting because so many of the problems Joe and I see in data systems have to do with the siloing between software teams and analytics teams. And so not enough collaboration across. And so ideally, if you were using similar frameworks to build applications and then do analytics, like similar knowledge graph paradigm, for example, that would be very helpful.
I think it would go part of the way, though, Matt, but would it go all the way?
I don't know.
You still got to get people to talk and
yeah.
like have a common vocabulary. I think like what John's saying. But I don't know.
Yeah.
Thoughts on his questions, John?
Yeah, I don't. My short answer, Brian, unfortunately, is I'm not really aware of them.
Okay. Easy
To
answer.
your point
All right.
about yeah.
Sorry, Brian.
And so the common language comment, Joe, was another one we get hung up on a little bit. And there's folks out there like in the data governance arena. A common language means you can only use one definition for customer, for example, or you can only use one. Like it's a very stick approach. If carrot and stick are kind of the options that you have, it can get pretty nasty. But when you have a common way of dealing with data, with dealing with language, like variations and interpretations and all that kind of stuff, it settles a whole whack of collaborative issues. And I totally think, if this conversation had another theme, it's that whole, talk to somebody, have a conversation, so Matt and I, for example, we were talking about the fact that my partner, Ruben Sardarian, thinks that data has no value. And I'm going, okay, that's an interesting perspective. And one I don't disagree with on some level, but I was reading some material on the data mesh, and the light just went on and said, oh, these guys are all talking about analytics. With the data have no value, folks basically see a pile of stuff that they have to sort out, and it's crap and all that kind of stuff, which often, I guess, judging by the statistics, it is often not in very good shape. But there is some value there. There's not no value. So if you put data in the center, if you put data midstream kind of thing, and the people that are creating data add value because they're recording transactions in the business, they're recording sales, they're recording contracts, they're recording all that stuff. The data that they provide to the analytics team has value. It's just that the analytics team doesn't see having value because that's a different perspective for them. They're looking down, they're
Well,
looking backwards, and they're looking forwards.
we're also ignoring software and applications that use data
Right.
all the time, and it
Right.
provides value there because the applications work usually. So
Yeah.
it's a huge disconnect. I think too often the data people are so data centric they forget the rest of the world and the data that actually, the people that produce the data that they use, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
So it's, before I forget, LinkedIn user, aka Jason Taylor, he has a question about MDM. This was earlier, but how do you feel about MDM given the challenges in graph formation? I think these challenges were mentioned early on at 908 when we wrote this, but
Oh, okay.
what are your thoughts on
Graph
data
formation.
management though? Yep.
Yeah, I mean, this is another thing that we tend to do as data people is we tend to split great big piles of stuff into buckets that don't necessarily work. So reference data, master data. I'm not dissing any of the people that work in these parts of the data management, but to us, it's all data, right? So if I wanted to create a graph of this particular event, I could take the people involved, the roles they have, all those kinds of things, and create a graph formation of that. And I wouldn't call any of it master data. I think that the difficulty with master data and a lot of like reference data is how do you, and I think you made this point before, Joe, is how do you access it? How do you make it not annoying? Right. So how do you make it immediately accessible master data if I have a company name and an address and all that kind of stuff without calling it necessarily master data? I'm not sure if that was the LinkedIn user's answer to this question, but it's sort of like trying to stay away from conventions that don't work. And I'm not saying master data doesn't work. I'm just sort of saying that in the bigger picture of supply and demand and supply chains and all that kind of stuff, is Joe Reese a master piece of data? Or is Calgary, Alberta a piece of master data? Like it's I don't know. It's classifying that stuff that way seems to be fraught with difficulties.
Your data has no value comment got some good responses here.
Okay.
And that's a LinkedIn post as well, right,
Yeah.
John?
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Colleen Tartot says data itself has no value until humans apply business knowledge to it. Scott Taylor, data has no value without analytics. It's like saying a baker saying flour has no value until you make it into bread.
All right,
so,
this is getting spicy.
I don't know.
This is great.
Nice.
Yeah,
Had to
so,
go, Scott. Yeah, the previous comment is what is typically what we get, right? Is like until you add knowledge to it. So and Scott's comeback is perfect. So the upstream supply chain has value. Like it would be like saying a tomato has no value unless someone puts it in a pizza. So it's the same kind of, so that's kind of, sure, there's lots of knowledge and stuff that we can add value, but it doesn't mean the things you're adding value to are valueless to begin with.
So how about this comparison? I mean,
Okay.
in the EU and other places, they have this notion of a value-added tax. And the idea is that you buy flour, right? And you pay some money as a baker
Right.
for flour.
Yeah.
And then you then turn that into bread and you resell it. And so there's value added in that process.
Okay.
And then you get taxed on the difference. It's kind of like a sales tax, but there's like this extra layer of adding value as it goes through the supply chain. And so maybe data is kind of the same way, where you start with, the raw ingredients and they have a certain value. And then as you sort of refine them and combine them with other things, you can think of adding value through the chain.
It's like somebody's writing a book on business value has been thinking about this. I don't know.
Well, this might end up in there. I hadn't thought of this until today, so I'm glad we had this
there you go.
conversation.
So is there a value added tax on flour?
So basically, yeah. So for example, even
Right, okay,
before
I
it
see what you
becomes
mean.
flour,
Right.
when it's just wheat,
yeah.
it will have a value, and then when it's resold as flour, there will be a value added tax because you've added value. Yeah.
Exactly right. And so along those lines, it would be really, that's the way I would push it too, is to say business language has value because of X, Y, Z. Right. And so using the FAIR principles, okay, I need to be able to find these things. Like they're not needles in a haystack anymore. I need to be able to find them. And holding down the aspect of data on FAIR, let's just talk about FAIR in terms of business glossaries. Accessible means that I found it. I might have found 4 different definitions. Those are accessible to my search string, right? Interoperable means that I've got definitions for each of those strings that are semantically equivalent to the string itself. So for example, fair stands for findable, accessible, right? And then a description or definition would also be semantically equivalent. So that's the interoperability part. So if I see fair anywhere that's in capital letters, I can maybe presume that that's what it means. And then the reusable part is dead simple. It's like somebody said the other day, wrote a paper that said, well, language is evolving at enormously rapid rates. But Merriam-Webster, they have something like 510,000 entries. Last year, they only added 320. I don't think that's rapid. I think that's a thing that we need to sort of knock down those myths and stuff and say, no, this is not as hard as it sounds. It's actually quite simple when you get into practice. So give you an example of real world. We had our grandson over for a couple of weeks in July. We had to buy stair gates to put right so the kid doesn't climb up the stairs, which he wants to do. Figuring out how those things work, holy. So the first couple of days I'm like, well, I'll throw it out and take my chainsaw to it or whatever. And then by the third or fourth day you think, oh, there's subtleties here. I need to learn that, that make it work better without the frustration. So I think once you get used to the idea that language is the upstream, to your point, Matt, the upstream value added stuff, or the things that you add value to, you're creating data from language. It's impossible to do it any other way. That's the whole premise of our business, is that once you get that idea in your head and you realize that there's patterns of this, that language is actually a very useful construct to build a foundation on, because it has temporality, it has references to real people, places, and things. It does activities, and you can create, instead of using a phrase like, oh, that guy with earphones on and a black t-shirt in front of a bookcase, why don't we call him Joe Reese? It's way shorter, it's way more convenient. So that kind of thing. So language has all that stuff built in. I think it's time we started to take advantage of it.
How do we teach this to the generation of data people that need to know about
cool.
this?
Great question. So when I was working for the local health authority here, they had the same question. It's like, nurses are not going to like this at all. Like, they have a job to do. They don't want to be nurses and doctors in front of cows, like computers on wheels. Like, that's got to be the lowest value use of human capital that I've ever witnessed in my life. So how are nurses going to get a handle on this, right? So we did a 2-hour session, or was it a 1-hour session, and I was one person, on basically how my kids and my wife classify socks. So the dimensionality of socks is color, style, purpose, like sports socks, dress socks, yada, yada, yada. The material they're made of, and color, if I hadn't mentioned color already. So my son basically puts all his socks in a drawer. He doesn't sort them or put them together or anything. He just throws them all in there. My daughter is a little bit better, because she arranges socks by color, and my wife arranges them by function. So she puts her dress socks on
I do
one
the same
side,
thing.
right? Yeah. So the question then becomes, and I don't have a sock drawer at all. I go barefoot all the time. So the question is, how do you create a search platform that will find socks in any of those 4 locations, 3 excluding me, without upsetting anybody's sensibilities? It's the same thing. So you've got five different facets, right? Color, style, da 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 da. And then what we did was connected them to finding patient information. So let's say, for example, the patient is semi-comatose or whatever, and said they're from Medicine Hat. Okay, that narrows it down a little bit. What was the last medical visit you had? Okay, I had a arthroscopic surgery on my knee. Okay, now we've narrowed it down quite a bit. So it's the whole idea that these categories of business language, of language in itself, have really, they have a lot of power to filter and find things that you want, right? And once, so the nurses they still talk about it and say, well, that guy with the socks video, the socks presentation, because they understand that a facet is color, size, and they also understand the facets of their business, and their needs are slightly different, but they work in exactly the same way. Business users really like this, Joe, because there's only 6 buckets to keep track of. You don't have to call it, and you don't have to call it any particular thing. You don't have to consult any particular application. You don't have to bounce around. You say, I'm looking for Costa Rica. And it's weird because a lot of the technology out there like Google and they do that already, but Google abandoned their search appliance inside of organizations like in 2016 or 18 because it didn't work. They couldn't make the inferences work. So there's the opportunity there too.
Colleen Tortel is saying she's processing not having a sock drawer. So sorry about that, but someday.
You've upset our listeners here.
Well, I guess if I was being honest, I could, the other option that might have come to mind is just throw my socks on my chair. And then my wife's constantly saying, would you have a sock drawer? You do have one. Yeah, that.
That's funny.
There you go.
Advice on how to manage socks here. So cool. Good place to end the show now.
Okay.
So, it's good having you on, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, you guys.
How do people find out more about you?
LinkedIn. We have semantium.io that they can go to and check it out. I'm constantly pushing articles just to try to get some traction on the ideas. They do. I'm also working on being less academic and less theoretical about this, but we are putting this stuff on the ground now. So it's working really well. So that's the best way to contact me.
Very cool. Yeah, great chat. Learned a lot. So
okay, yeah, very interesting, guys.
Coming up
Great.
for you guys, or
yeah, DEMA in November is coming up. We have some really interesting conversations going on with folks in Australia and UK about, and there's lots and lots of stuff happening around language and stuff and definitions. So yeah, just keep pushing the rock and always looking for funding and interested investors and that kind of stuff. We did last September. We did a boot camp kind of thing for startups, and man, that was gut wrenching. So just to wrap it up, we finished our first presentation. One guy goes, I have no idea what you guys are talking about. And it's like, that's the kind of thing you want to hear right off the top. So we've worked on the messaging quite a bit, and I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here, guys. And it's been a lot of fun.
Anytime.
Oh, one real quick closing comment.
Yep.
I had a conversation with Ron Giottini out of New Hampshire. And basically he said something along the lines of follow the money when it comes to data analytics. So when you're trying to decide as a company about which data to try to turn into analytics, see how it connects to the financial statements. If it's going to make a difference in the financial statements, go for it. If it's not, dump it. So there you go. That's my closing remarks. Awesome. Thanks, gentlemen. Oh, it's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Look forward to talking again soon. This is fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Chat soon, man. See ya.
Yeah. Bye.